Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me well enough? Excellent. Okay. So today, when I was invited to come and give this presentation, it was pitched around, what's happening with ISIS and Iraq and the Middle East and all that sort of thing. But I think there's a base level of knowledge we need to get across. There's a bigger picture here that we need to be able to see in order to have an informed understanding of, what's going on in the Middle East and around these kinds of issues that we're seeing in the media today. So what I'm going to speak about is jihads, caliphates and Muslim groups in a general sense. I'll begin by talking about jihad, and I'll talk about, what does this concept mean according to the Quran, the holy book of Muslims. And then I'll talk a little bit about how the concept has evolved over time through the era of the Muslim empires, into the colonial and the post-colonial period, into modern times with the militant groups that we've become familiar with today. And I'll talk a little bit about why these militant jihadist groups emerge in the first place. Then we'll move on to talk about caliphates, this supposed system of Muslim government that a number of different groups are advocating today. We'll talk about the use of that term or that concept in the Quran, and then we'll move into talking about how that developed in respect to Muslim empires over the 1,000 or so, 1,500 years of Islamic history. Then we'll have a look at this concept of caliphate as a doctrine and talk about how it developed and how it came to be assumed to be part of the Islamic system, the so-called Islamic system. And then we'll have a look at some contemporary movements, including ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and others that advocate this particular system of government. But I think what's important then is to move on from that and talk about the appeal of this kind of the ideas of these groups, and a little bit about why they're able to recruit seemingly so well, particularly among young Western Muslims. So we'll begin by talking about the concept of jihad. Taking the Quran is the holy book of Muslims. It was essentially revealed over a 2-decade period between the year 610 and the year 632. For those of you who don't have a background in this, the Islamic religion follows on after Judaism and then Christianity, and then Islam comes afterwards around the 7th century. The founder of Islam is someone by the name of Muhammad. He's referred to as Muslims as a prophet. Muslims regard him as the last prophet to be sent to humankind. Muslims also recognise previous prophets, Moses, Abraham. They consider Jesus a prophet as well. So Muhammad is born in the city of Mecca, which is in today's modern Saudi Arabia. He was born around the year 570, but is said to have received his first revelation of the Quran around the year 610, when he was about 40 years old. And he continued to receive these revelations according to Islamic teachings over the next 20 years until his death in the year 632. So it's because the Quran contains the essential teachings of Islam, it's the main scripture of the Muslim religion, it's to the Quran that we refer to get an understanding of this concept of jihad. The word itself comes from the root word juhud, which means to strive, struggle, or make an effort. And in the Arabic language, which is the language of the Quran, the language in which the Quran was revealed, the word is used in this sense, striving, struggling, making an effort. And in the Arabic language, Arabs will use it in this way as well. However, from a Westerner's perspective, and from the perspective of many of these militant groups, the word has come to be narrowed to be exclusively about armed struggle. So we'll come to that in a moment. But when looking at the Quran, we can see about 150 verses that talk about war and peace. We also notice that these are revealed in a particular context. They're revealed in the latter half of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, when he was at war with the Meccans. The Meccans were idol worshippers. Muhammad was preaching monotheism, or the idea of worshipping one God. Interestingly enough, Muslims use this word Allah, but when they use this word Allah, they're simply using the Arabic word for God. Any of you who have travelled to the Middle East and attended a church sermon in the Middle East would have heard the word Allah. So Arabic-speaking Christians also use the word Allah in reference to God. So when Muslims are using the word Allah, they're not talking about a different God, they're talking about the same God as in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So Muhammad preached monotheism, and this put him at odds with his fellow townsmen in Mecca. Around the year 622, he had to flee Mecca with his companions, and he set up his own, he became a leader of the city of Medina. And it was during this period that a number of battles were fought with the Quraysh tribe. That was the tribe into which Muhammad was born, and this was the tribe that was basically the advocates of polytheism against his monotheistic vision. So the context of the verses that contain the word jihad is this period where Muhammad is already at war with the polytheists of Mecca, the Quraysh tribe. So if we look at the Quran, we can see the word jihad is mentioned about 35 times. The word itself, or one of its grammatical equivalents, is mentioned about 35 times in the Quran. In 4 of those verses, we can explicitly see that it's being used in a militant or combative sense. In 11 of those verses, it's being used in a pacific sense. The word jihad, as I mentioned, means striving, struggling, making an effort. So for the Muslim, this could mean a spiritual struggle, overcoming your base desires, being a better human being. It can also mean a physical struggle in the sense that, you go out and get a university degree, you go out and earn a living for your family, etc. So any form of striving could fit the definition of the word jihad. Also, to be charitable is another form of jihad. To be able to look after the poor and the needy, those less fortunate than yourself, is also part of this definition of jihad. But we also see in the Quran that it's used in the sense of armed struggle as well. There are about 20 uses of the word jihad where the definition is open. It could be physical and it could be militant, or it could be pacific. So we've got these different uses of the word jihad in the Quran. We also find this other word, qital. The word qital is used exclusively for fighting. And so we find this word used in most of the verses concerning war and peace in the Quran. I mentioned there's about 150 verses. Most of them are using this word qital rather than jihad. Now, to have a look at some of the Quranic verses where we find references to fighting or war and so forth. But we begin with this verse that says, "Have you not turned your attention to those who were told to hold back their hands from fighting and establish regular prayer and give regular charity?" This is a reference to the early period of Islam, the first 13 years while Muhammad was living in Mecca. Islam at this time had nothing to do with fighting, even in self-defense or any form of armed struggle. The instruction to the Muslims at this time in the Quran was, your religion is about establishing prayer and being charitable. And so there was no permission given to the Muslims to fight, even though they were being persecuted by the Meccans, the Quraysh tribe. It was only after Muhammad migrated to Medina in the year 622 that the Muslims were given permission to defend themselves. And this verse here is the very first verse that was revealed after this migration, this hijrah, in the year 622, where the Muslims were given this permission to fight. And the verse reads like this: "To those against whom war is made, permission is given to fight, because they have been wronged. And verily God is most powerful for their aid. Those who have been expelled from their homes in defiance of right for no cause except that they say, 'Our Lord is God.' If God did not check one set of people by means of another, there would surely have been pulled down monasteries, churches, synagogues and mosques, in which the name of God is commemorated in abundant measure." Very interesting verse. Because when we think about Islam, in fact, when we think about many religions, we think of them as being fairly exclusive. But what the Quran is saying here is that you have been given permission to fight to defend essentially monotheism. Hence the reference to churches, synagogues, and monasteries, as well as mosques. So it seems as though in this early period what Islam was concerned about is that people being free to being able to practice monotheism in a society that was very staunchly polytheistic. So that's an important point to note, but I think that point is lost on many Muslims today, and it's certainly lost on those who belong to these various militant groups. Moving on and looking at what else the Quran has to say about war and conflict and so on, we find these verses that suggest to us what the reason is for Muslims being given permission to fight. Fight in the cause of God those who fight you but do not transgress limits, for God doesn't love the transgressors. Slay them where you find them, turn them out from where they turned you out, for tumult and oppression are worse than killing. And fight them until there is no more tumult and oppression, there prevails justice and faith in God. But if they cease, let there be no hostility except against those who practice oppression. And another verse reads, and why should you not fight in the cause of God? And in the cause of those being weak and ill-treated, men, women and children, whose cry is, our Lord, rescue us from this town whose people are oppressors, and raise us from thee one who will protect, raise us from thee one who will help. So quite clearly, we're starting to get the sense that there is a theme here in respect to these verses on jihad or fighting or issues of war and peace. And that is, people are given permission to defend themselves in response to the aggression of other people. Constantly we see in these verses references to oppression, people being driven from their homes and lands, people being denied the right to be able to worship as they please, etc. People being denied their basic human rights. These are the kinds of references we find in the Quran. Now the question is, is fighting an end in itself, or is it considered a means to an end? There are a whole lot of verses in the Quran that suggest it's a means to an end. We've got verses like this. If they, the enemy, incline towards peace, you too should also incline towards peace and trust in God. Verily he is all-seeing, all-knowing. Should they seek to deceive you with their show of peace, God is sufficient for you. And another verse reads, if they let you be and do not make war on you and offer you peace, God does not allow you to harm them. So we have these very clear verses that fighting is not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. So if we look at all of these verses collectively, this 150 verses or so concerning war and peace in the Quran, we can see that there are three main objectives, or what we call in Arabic maqasid. For the translators, objectives. Three main objectives would be that fighting is not for any purpose. It is for the purpose of self-defense. It's for overcoming some sort of oppression, and the Quran mentions people being driven from their homes and land, being denied basic rights, including the right to freely worship one God. And also we find another objective here, and that is establishing a just peace. And this is where we find these references to oppression and people being entitled to their basic rights. If we look at how the Muslim armies evolve, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, we can see that at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, which is up until the year 632, we can see that Islam was basically confined to the western side of the Arabian Peninsula, and then a little bit here in the east as well. It was only after the time of the Prophet Muhammad that we see the expansion of Islam outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And you can see that his close companions, the first four caliphs, as they are known, and I'll talk about that in a minute, took Islam outside of the Arabian Peninsula into areas of Syria, into areas of Iraq, and also into parts of North Africa. Following that, we see the rapid expansion of Islam across North Africa, into Central Asia, all the way over to India, and all the way over to Spain as well. So we see a fairly vast territory come under Muslim rule within a very short period of time. We're talking in less than 100 years, a major section of that part of the world at the time. We're talking about the lands of the Sassanid Empire, as well as much of the territory of the Byzantine Empire comes under Muslim rule. So we've got rapid expansion here. So in this context, it's necessary to look at the evolution of this concept of jihad, because it seems that this concept was a central tool of empires for the expansion of not necessarily Islam as a religion, although that did come later on, but certainly the expansion of Islamic rule or Islamic empires. So jihad becomes a tool of empire. And this is a consequence of the way particular scholars and rulers understood and interpreted the concept of jihad as described in the Quran. They looked at it as evolving in stages rather than looking at it in context. They didn't think that jihad is revealed in relation to this situation where the Muslims were already at war with the Quraysh and there was a need to defend themselves. They looked at this as progressively extensive permission from God for Muslims to be able to take control over all of the territory in which they encompassed. And so scholars have noted that it begins with no fighting, then it moves into fighting in self-defense, fighting for the spread of Islam against non-Muslims, and then it's fighting for the territorial expansion of Muslim lands. A couple of scholars, Shafi and Ibn Hazm, who are quite famous in Islamic history, were among the advocates of this idea. They basically said the Quran, the permission that Muslims are given to fight is not about aggression towards them. It's about fighting against people not because they're aggressive, but because they're non-Muslims, because of their faith or their lack of faith in Islam. And that was a fundamental shift from what we see described in the Quran. The Quran doesn't actually give Muslims permission to fight against people because they're not Muslims. It's giving them permission to fight because of their aggression. But this is lost on the perspective of scholars like these. They give primacy to what is considered to be the last verse of the Quran to be revealed concerning war and peace. This verse, verse 9:5, often referred to in literature as the sword verse, reads like this: "And when the sacred months are over, slay the idolaters wherever you may come upon them, take them captive and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every conceivable place. Yet if they repent and take to prayer and render the purifying dues, then let them go their way, for God is much forgiving, a dispenser of grace." This is considered to be the last verse revealed in the Quran concerning, what is, generally referred to as jihad. And so primacy is given by some of these scholars to this particular verse. And as you can see, it appears to be quite, it appears to be advocating quite an offensive form of combat here. Other scholars, like Sarakhsi in the 11th century as well, advocated this idea of progressively increasing aggression towards non-Muslims in terms of fighting. He advocated a Quranic policy of warfare against non-Muslims according to 5 stages, beginning with trust, forgiveness and withdrawal, extending to preaching and inviting them to Islam, fighting in self-defense, aggressive fighting at certain times, and then aggressive fighting in absolute terms. And you get a version of this with what we've been hearing in respect to ISIS. They're confronting particular non-Muslim communities, basically saying to them, you've got the opportunity to convert to Islam here, or we're going to go to war with you. Those kinds of conditions. And they have an origin in this kind of thinking. How is it done? How is it that we read verses of the Quran that seemingly say that permission is given to fight in self-defense, yet what we see when we look at Muslim history is that it wasn't defensive but offensive? It basically revolves around this concept of naskh, or abrogation. That ultimately gave primacy to the sword verse that I showed you earlier. So essentially, we see a situation where 124 to about 140 verses are completely abrogated by the sword verse. And that includes all of those that say, if the enemy incline towards peace, you too should incline towards peace. If they don't attack you, you don't have the right to attack them. Those kinds of verses are all abrogated as far as this thinking goes, leaving only the sword verse, which is interpreted as giving Muslims permission to attack people because they're non-Muslims. The validity that is cited is a couple of verses in the Quran which have actually nothing to do with this concept of verses abrogating other verses. These are actually about, if you become a Muslim, you follow the Quran as opposed to if previously following the Bible, for example. They've got nothing to do with verses abrogating other verses. But what are the consequences? There was one scholar at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, his name's Isra Ahmed Khan. He did a major study on this concept of abrogation, and he said this is basically the consequence. According to the supporters of naskh, or abrogation, all the Quranic verses which exhort believers to be just, fair, kind and soft in their dealings with non-believers are abrogated by 2 Quranic rulings, those in 9:5 and those in 9:29. If a society or a nation is under the influence of scholars believing in the sanctity of abrogation, its policies of international relationship will have 2 different provisions. One applicable to Muslim communities and nations, and another applicable to non-Muslim communities or people and states. This policy concerning non-Muslims will be based on hatred, contempt, intolerance and violence, as deemed to have been suggested by verses 9.5 and 9.29. But the state's siding with those who reject this concept of, or this theory of abrogation as invalid, will found its foreign policy on the principles of justice, cooperation, kindness and softness as exhorted by all of those verses which are considered abrogated. It will apply the rulings of verses like 9.5 only in a situation of war with some formidable enemy who avowedly is trying to harm national peace, harmony, safety or security. We now move to a more modern era where we find the anti-colonial struggles around the 18th century to the 20th century. We see here Muslims returning to a more Quranic-oriented definition of jihad because they're no longer in charge of major empires and being able to use jihad for the expansion of their territory. They're using jihad here for the defence of their territory or the liberation from colonial rule. So national liberation struggles around the Muslim world used this concept of jihad. Also for the eradication of something that some scholars and leaders referred to as jahiliyyah. This is an Arabic word that means basically ignorance. So they were trying to remove what they referred to as un-Islamic elements from society, hangovers from colonial times. Also, we saw some Islamic revolutions take place, most notably the Islamic revolution that occurred in Iran in 1979, where jihad was used to advocate for people to overthrow, in this case, the Shah of Iran. And what was established in its place was an Islamic Republic of Iran. And also for the overthrow of Muslim rulers not deemed to be sufficiently Islamic. We've seen that take place in different parts of the Muslim world in the post-colonial era. As far as militant jihadists are concerned, we're talking here now in the 20th century and the 21st century. An important question is, why do they emerge in the first place? I would say one of the main reasons why we see Muslim militant groups or jihadist groups emerge is because of some foreign occupation or some bid for national liberation. If we take Palestine, for example, Hamas came into existence after 20 years of an illegal Israeli military occupation. I say illegal Israeli military occupation because that's how it's described by the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Council. Similarly, in Lebanon, Hezbollah came into existence as a consequence of Israel's occupation of Lebanon. In Chechnya, the Chechen rebels came into existence as a consequence of Russian occupation. In Iraq, the various groups that we hear of today were unheard of at the time of Saddam Hussein. These groups only emerged following the US occupation of Iraq. In the Philippines, there's a fairly long history here, beginning with Spanish colonial occupation, followed by American colonial occupation. And as a consequence of various policies of the Spanish, and then reinforced by the Americans, we had the emergence of groups like Abu Sayyaf and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. In China as well, we have in the Eastern Turkestan region, we have the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement emerging. These are people who are not Han Chinese. They're ethnically different from the Chinese that most people would be familiar with. They don't see their lands as being part of China, although China certainly sees it that way. They're fighting for autonomy, and various policies of the Chinese government have led to, the emergence of this resistance group. Another factor in the emergence of Muslim militant groups or jihadist groups is political repression. And we can see this quite clearly in places like Egypt, with groups like Jamaat al-Jihad or Islamic Jihad. Some of you may be familiar with a group or a movement called the Muslim Brotherhood that emerged in Egypt in the late 1920s. Became a very popular grassroots movement that advocated for a higher observance of Islamic duties, but also provided particular social services. And it became a popular movement not just in Egypt, but all around the Middle East and North Africa and in the broader Muslim world, I would add. This particular group has, consistently been repressed by the government in Egypt. Many of its leaders have been imprisoned, tortured, executed, etc. And it was at the time of the execution of a leader by the name of Sayyid Qutb in 1966 that there was a splinter within the Muslim Brotherhood. The group had always advocated an evolutionary approach, that we continue to encourage people to be more religiously observant, we continue to provide social services, and eventually Egyptian society will become more Islamic, and that will bring about a change in leadership in Egypt. But what happened after 1966 was groups within the Muslim Brotherhood came to the conclusion that we're never going to achieve our goals through evolution. We're only going to achieve them through revolution. We need to take up arms here against the Egyptian government. And so these various groups emerged in response. Many of these groups have ceased to be, a recognised force in Egypt today because many of them are either imprisoned or killed or went off to join other groups like Al-Qaeda, for example. But the context of the emergence of these groups is this political repression in Egypt. And we continue to see that going on today. The Muslim Brotherhood was, won the elections in the post-Arab Spring period, removed from power, and then, again we can see a continuation of the repression of the Muslim Brotherhood. In Algeria, we have a situation that, is somewhat similar. After Algeria had historically been ruled by the French, and in the aftermath of French colonial rule, we see a political party, the FLN, take power. And they had ruled Algeria through its post-colonial history until 1990, when there were elections and an Islamically oriented party called the FIS won those elections. They were denied the right to rule. Their members were arrested, thrown in jail, tortured, assets were seized, etc. And what resulted was a 10-year civil war in Algeria that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And many had to flee the country, etc. So again, it's this situation of political repression that has led to groups like the GIA in Algeria. Then in other cases, it's somewhat more perplexing. Countries like Pakistan, while Pakistan has had long periods of military rule, dictatorships, Islamic parties have always been part of the political landscape in Pakistan. The Jamaat-e-Islami, an Islamic party, was one of the founding parties of the state of Pakistan following the split with India. So Islamic parties have always been part of the process in Pakistan. So it's not because of political repression in this sense that we can explain the emergence of groups like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Harakat al-Mujahideen, or Lashkar-e-Toiba. They've emerged because of other reasons. And I would say part of the explanation has to be they've developed an extremist ideology that is informed by the kind of Islam that we see in Saudi Arabia. This Wahhabi Islam that's been imported into different Muslim countries, including Pakistan, in the form of Deobandi schools of thought. I don't want to overwhelm you with these terms, but the ideology of Islam that we find in places like Saudi Arabia plays a huge role in the development of these extremist ideologies we find in other parts of the world. In Somalia, groups like Al-Shabaab, I think, have emerged because of a similar extremist ideology. Indonesia is another good example. If we think about Indonesia, we can see that they had the Reformasi movement in 1998, and following that we see the overthrow of Suharto, who ruled as in a form of a dictatorship for many decades. And but now we see post-1998, we see an opening up of the political process in Indonesia, and we see many Islamically oriented parties taking part in those elections post-1998. And so, we don't see the same factors at play here. So why would a group like Jamaat Islamiyah emerge? A group that also advocates this idea of a caliphate, although confined to Southeast Asia. So the three reasons that I put to you for the emergence of these jihadists or these Islamic militant groups are some sort of foreign occupation and a move for national liberation, political repression, or extremist ideology. But I think that it's important to have a look at some of the movements that developed around the Muslim world that have informed the way Islam is understood and, in large part, practiced by Muslims globally today. One of the most important movements was the Muslim Brotherhood. Essentially, the Muslim Brotherhood was a peaceful movement. It wasn't advocating the use of violence necessarily. It was a grassroots movement, as I said, encouraging Muslims to be more religiously observant, and also providing for various social welfare in the country. So providing people with loans, building schools, building clinics, etc. Those kinds of activities were a main part of the work of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we see even groups like Hamas in Palestine, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, do that same kind of work. Even Hezbollah in Lebanon historically has done that same kind of work. But I suppose the key idea that the Muslim Brotherhood advocated that became widespread all around the Muslim world is that Islam is the solution to all of the social, political, economic and other problems that Muslim countries are facing. There was a certain anti-Western sentiment within the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think that has provided some fertile ground for the us and them mentality, and also for this mentality that everything, all problems can be solved in Islam. Islam is completely self-sufficient. We don't need anything from the West. We need to return to following a strict Islamic law. We need to go back to the Quran and the prophetic traditions for the answers to our questions. That kind of thinking, I think, has provided fertile ground for many of the movements that we see today. But I think that the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood were tempered by the fact that they weren't necessarily advocates of violence. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the movement, advocated for an evolutionary grassroots approach rather than a revolutionary, violent militant approach. I think that probably the movement that is perhaps more central to the situation that we see today with the emergence of these violent jihadist groups is the Wahhabi movement that we see in Saudi Arabia. Because of the oil money that Saudi Arabia has, it's been able to export this ideology all around the Muslim world. This is done by building mosques in different countries, sending scholars to be imams in these places, providing scholarships to young people from all around the Muslim world, including Western countries like here in Australia, taking them to Saudi Arabia, educating them in institutions over there, then sending them back home. And so they've been able to spread this Wahhabi ideology all around the world. What is this ideology all about? Essentially, it began as a movement to purify Islam of what were regarded as un-Islamic elements. Islam is a strictly monotheistic religion, and this movement was strictly monotheistic. At the time that the movement emerged in the 17th century, essentially Muslims were engaged in what was described as the worship of saints, and that has no real place in Islam. That Muslims were not following the Quran and the prophetic traditions strictly. And so what Wahhabism did was basically bring a very strong puritanical literalist approach to Islam. And we see this quite clearly with ISIS today. If you look at a number of the things that ISIS are doing in Iraq, including the destruction of historical sites and other places of worship and so forth, this is akin to what the Saudis have done in Saudi Arabia through this Wahhabist ideology. The other group associated with this that you will often hear about is the Salafists, or this movement of Salafism. Not all Salafists are the same. Some of them are militant jihadists, like those that are in groups like ISIS. Others are political but non-violent, and you see some of the political parties in Egypt, for example, would fit into that category. They do advocate for the implementation of the Sharia law, and that's a whole other issue that I don't think we have time to go into now, but maybe during question time. And then you have others that are non-violent and apolitical. All they want to do is live sort of an austere life. They may present themselves, if they're men, with long beards, you know, wearing robes, turbans, etc. Females may wear face veils. So they adopt a very strict, what they refer to as an Islamic lifestyle, but they're not interested in politics and they're not interested in violence. So there's different groups within the Salafists, but the ones we tend to hear about most are the militant jihadist types. Most scholars who have looked at groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others agree that the movement that best represents them is probably a group that emerged early on in Muslim history, just after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, at the time of the fourth caliph, and I'll come to explain this history in a moment. There was a major schism within the Muslim community, and there was a further offshoot that took place, and this group was called the Khawarij. They developed an extremist interpretation of Islam, where they said that anybody who commits a sin is out of the fold of Islam, and they become a legitimate target for violence. This includes those who were otherwise considered Muslim, as well as non-Muslims. And so, oops, my screen just turned off. But you've still got it there. There we go. Okay, and so the Khawarij, because of this declaration that they make of all others who don't subscribe to their view being non-Muslims and legitimate targets for violence, are very much like many of these groups we see today, particularly Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others that are associated with them. So that idea of a complete disregard for human life, targeting people with violence, etc., has its origins at this time in the 7th century, just after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. I might pause for a minute here and just ask, are there any questions up to this point?